a public health problem, gun violence. Therefore, anyone who has a gun is potentially a public enemy. Therefore, I, the governor, can ban the possession of guns. You know, it has a perverse logic about it. But it's the end. It's the end of constitutional government.
This is Kaiser Johnson with Liberty and Finance, and this is the Miles Franklin Weekly Special for September 11th through 18th, 2023, while supplies last. First, when you purchase a bundle of 5 10-ounce Nordic Mint bars and 5 5-ounce bars, all 10 bars are priced at just $1.89 over spot per ounce. 3/9 fine silver, these are priced lower than anything else other than full-size Comex bars, but obviously offer far better liquidity. The Gold Eagle was first released in 1986 and has been one of the most popular gold bullion coins in the world, providing incredible recognizability and investor trust. The 1/10 Eagle is additionally sought after for its high degree of flexibility and liquidity. Like the 1-ounce Eagle, the 1/10 Eagle is 22-karat gold strengthened with copper. It's 1/10 of a troy ounce of gold, comes 50 to a tube, 5,000 to a box, and is available at just $37.50 over melt while supplies last. Finally, the Gold Eagle is IRA eligible. Next, from Valcambi, a Swiss mint known for producing some of the highest quality products in precious metals, we have Kilo Silver bars, which are 32.15 troy ounces of 3/9 fine silver, cast with individual serial numbers and a beautiful antique-style finish. They are only $1.99 over spot per ounce. They come 15 to a box and are IRA eligible. And for your choice silver rounds, you may choose between the iconic Silver Buffalo round made by various private mints across the US and the Silver Asahi round from Japan. Both 3/9 fine, both 20 to a tube. The Asahi rounds are also IRA eligible. And if you'd like to learn more about a precious metals IRA, call us, and we'll be happy to help you in that process. To order our specials or any of the many other options we have available, call us at 1-888-81-LIBERTY. That's 1-888-815-4237. We're available after hours and on weekends, and we look forward to speaking with you.
Welcome back to Liberty and Finance. We are privileged to have this distinguished returning guest. Dr. Edwin Vieira is a constitutional attorney. He has argued cases up to and including the United States Supreme Court. He's written extensively on sound money, such as his book Pieces of Eight, and is also an expert on the Second Amendment, among other cases of overreach by the government. Dr. Vieira, thank you for joining us again on Liberty and Finance.
Oh, thank you for the opportunity of being with you.
I always learn a lot from you when you visit, and I've heard many of our viewers say, I'm going to have to listen to this interview 2 or 3 times because you often give us an education in the principles, the precedents, and what went wrong and what we need to do to make it go right. In this case, we wanted to have you on this week because just this week, the governor of New Mexico, Lujan Grisham, has supposedly temporarily suspended open and concealed carry laws in Bernalillo County, which otherwise would be part of basically it's in violation of the Second Amendment, or you'll clarify for us whether it is or not. But one of the key statements that was made by her about that was that the Constitution is, quote, not absolute and should be able to be suspended on a temporary basis for public health crises, which she is deeming the level of gun violence that they've been experiencing in that county. Can you talk to us? There's got to be several angles of this that are worthy of examination, one of which is it even possible from a legal basis for a governor to, quote unquote, temporarily suspend the Constitution, or that the Constitution is not absolute? And secondly, how has that worked out in the past when leaders, people in positions of power say they're going to temporarily suspend freedoms, and then I guess later on we can talk about if that's not the right way to do it, what is the right way, or what are some other options that would be constitutionally viable? Certainly in this case, we've had examples of the local sheriff and the attorney general saying that they believe that this will not be supported, is not supportable. But I'll like to unleash you on this topic of the Constitution not being absolute and governors being able to, quote unquote, temporarily suspend the Second Amendment, et cetera, due to public health crises.
Well, the short answer is that the governor of a state has no authority to suspend any part of the Constitution or statutory laws, or for that matter, regulations, administrative bodies might put out at the level of the United States government. I mean, zero. There's nothing there that allows that. In principle, in practice, whatever. Now, this whole problem comes back to something that we saw during the COVID era, the first COVID era, I might say, that there's some kind of a concept called emergency powers that can be invoked in certain circumstances to nullify statutes temporarily, or perhaps to suspend temporarily provisions in the Constitution of a state or the Constitution of the United States. And that brings me back to this concept of emergency powers. Now, as a historical example, the Constitution of the Weimar Republic in Germany, the republic that came into existence at the end of World War I, and then essentially to the time when Hitler became the chancellor of Germany, and then he pretty much set it aside. It was, to a large extent, modeled in certain ways on the Constitution of the United States. It recognized freedom of speech, freedom of religion, right to private property, and so forth. It looked a lot like, in some of its provisions, it looked a lot like provisions of the Bill of Rights in our Constitution. And I think most scholars will say that, in fact, the Germans who drew up the Weimar Constitution were influenced by the United States Constitution. However, the German Constitution had a suspension clause built into it that under certain, what we would call emergency circumstances, the top leaders in the German central government could suspend those particular provisions, and it mentioned them by name. And, of course, the Weimar government had used that on several occasions. And Hitler seized on it and then went much beyond it. He essentially abrogated the Weimar Constitution entirely after he set himself up as Chancellor and Führer. He gave himself those two titles. But in any event, it was there. So you can imagine a situation where a constitution would have an emergency powers provision in which it defined what the emergency might be, who would act under this specific emergency, and what particular rights that the Constitution otherwise recognized would be suspended, how, and for how long. Now, that's quite different. That's something the Weimar people invented on their own. They didn't take that from the Constitution of the United States because no such provision exists. You can imagine a statute which defines an emergency in a certain way, and it says that, let's say the president, or let's take the example of this governor. You can imagine a statute of Nevada that would say, here are some circumstances which we, the legislature, are going to declare to be an emergency circumstance. And when these circumstances arise, then the governor can take the following actions, A, B, C, D, E, for the length of time that this emergency exists. And I would say typically that would have to be a situation where the legislature could grant that power to the governor without an emergency, but wanted to limit its grant to emergency circumstances that were defined in a particular way. And then that would require the government to, or the governor in this case that I'm positing, the governor would have to fit the definition of an emergency that existed in this statute and make a declaration, that's usually the case, a declaration of emergency, based on specific facts that would fit the statutory requirements. So it wouldn't be a matter of a generalized power. You can do any bloody thing you want because you're the governor and we the legislature, say so, or the governor takes that power on herself in this particular case. It's because that's the kind of a power that the Constitution would allow to the governor, given its own terms, as in the Weimar case, or given the exercise of some power by the legislature. And then the governor would have to comply in some rational manner with the terms and conditions of that grant of emergency powers. And it brings you back to, there's an old doctrine called the doctrine of constitutional fact. If some action by a public official is dependent upon the existence of a particular fact, that fact has to be proven before a court. Or I should put it the other way, someone could challenge the governor's action by saying that fact doesn't exist and go into a court, and the court would have the authority to decide whether the fact existed or not, and if it didn't exist, then the governor's assertion of that supposed emergency power would be nullified. All right. So that doesn't seem to be what this governor in Nevada is predicating her action on. There doesn't seem to be a Weimar German emergency powers provision that she's asserting, or some generalized power that's granted, say, in the Constitution of Nevada. And she made that statement that her oath of office is not absolute. Well, heaven's sake, what does that mean? Right? I mean, you take every witness in a courtroom takes an oath, right, to testify truthfully, and that's essentially the oath of a witness, the oath of office of the witness. Is that oath absolute, or can the witness fib every now and then? What are we talking about here? It's not that on the face of it is nonsense, right? But then she comes to the second point that not all constitutional rights are absolute, in reference to the Second Amendment, which she has no power to decide the absolute or non-absolute nature of the Second Amendment, how far it goes or doesn't go. But one could say, pretty much off the top of one's head, that there always is a core element of every constitutional right, which is absolute. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a right, by hypothesis. Okay? And the right always imposes a corresponding duty on people who might claim the power to infringe upon that right. So her basic principles of action are, let me just say, nonsensical from a constitutional point of view. They make no sense whatsoever. And in fact, they are, I would say, anti-constitutional. But then she adds another problem here. This is not simply an emergency in some generalized sense. She is talking about an emergency with respect to public health. And now we get into another area where the legislature of Nevada may have spoken to that whole question. Right? One of the authorities of various officials in certain public health situations. No doubt they have. The legislature has spoken to that. No doubt there are statutes and probably certain kinds of regulations that already exist there, to which the governor would have to conform. I mean, it is conceivable that you could imagine that the legislature would give some kind of quote-unquote emergency power to the governor to declare some kind of a curfew in highly populated sections of a town or whatever, when there was bubonic plague had been detected. And then there would be particular standards to determine, well, who detected this, to what extent was it detected, what the elements of the curfew would be, how it would have to be established in relation to facts that were required by the legislature in the statute, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, as far as I've been able to tell from the few things that have been broadcast on the internet, none of that was done. This is just kind of an off the top of her head ukase, as the Russian czars would have said, that she seems to think that some violence involving guns creates a public health emergency, and that somehow gives her an emergency power outside of her own oath of office, because she's admitting it's outside of her own oath of office, at least implicitly, to nullify a federal constitutional right. So the whole thing's a mishmash. I mean, there's nothing there that's legitimate. Even though, I mean, the logic of the thing falls apart. Forget the law. The logic of the thing falls apart. And that's why I'm sure the Attorney General of Nevada and the particular sheriff, I saw one of them, there may be more.
Yeah, let me interrupt. This is New Mexico that we're referring to.
Excuse me, yeah, New Mexico. And even a couple of Democratic politicians at the federal level have looked askance at this. Who was David Hogg, right? The anti-Second Amendment advocate. Even he came out and said, well, this is unconstitutional. And I thought it was interesting with the sheriff. I did see the sheriff. He said he wasn't going to enforce this because it was unconstitutional. Well, he's got another reason for not enforcing it. If he were to enforce it, he and his deputies would be subject to a civil rights suit against them and his department. I'm surprised he didn't say that, because that's the liability he has. I would wonder what the liability he has under the state law. But leave that aside. He certainly has liability, potentially liability, under the federal law if he were to enforce that dictate from the governor and a particular individual sued him as the enforcing authority. And that's another instance. How does this governor think this was going to be enforced? Right? What were the penalties, number one, and who was going to do the enforcement? So it was obviously something that she kind of excogitated off the top of her head, if you will. And then we get to the question of logic here. Well, what's the public health relationship to the carrying of firearms legitimately? Talking about people who either have, I don't know what they have in that particular state, but say they have some kind of a permit for conceal carry, and otherwise they have open carry, doesn't require a permit. Well, there you're talking about people who are basically law-abiding. We're not talking about the criminal class. The carrying of a firearm is not necessarily connected to anything that has to do with public health. And I guess she's arguing that some people have been killed by firearms. Life and death are related to public health, and therefore public health authority allows you to regulate firearms in some way, forgetting the Second Amendment, just as a generality. Right? The Second Amendment comes in as a restriction here. And I suppose that could be said about automobile accidents, slip and fall in homes, death in bathtubs. I mean, could she regulate the installation of bathrooms? Could she regulate the kind of carpets people had to have on their stairs because they might slip and fall? Could she regulate the hours in which people of certain ages could drive on certain streets in certain types of cars? Because there are automobile accidents that result in death or personal injury. And you begin to look at the breadth of the claim that's made, and it's, what shall I say, you're talking about light years in terms of the breadth of this thing. It's amazing. And, of course, that goes back to her theory at the beginning that her oath of office is not absolute. Well, if her oath of office is not absolute, I guess the corollary of that is her power is absolute. Because if her oath of office doesn't limit her power, but she claims power, then I guess she has all the power that she could imagine. Or is she saying, well, my oath of office is an absolute, but also my power is an absolute? Don't the two of them go together in some way? And if her power is an absolute, well, then how does she justify what she's just done? Because I've never heard the justification other than this strange claim to public health, which is open-ended because all sorts of things, almost anything people do in a social context, maybe even an individual context, may have a relationship to health. Maybe not public health if you're a hermit, your individual health, but certainly if you're in society in some way. Almost anything you do may have some relationship to public health. So is all of that subject to her spontaneous individual regulation as governor without any ability to challenge that because her oath of office is not absolute? Is that the way that works? So, I mean, this thing goes, in a sense, it's non-rational. But the next level of it is, forgetting the state law for the moment, her target is a federal constitutional right. So now we're talking not simply about nullification in the sense that, let's say, the southern states did, John C. Calhoun's concept of nullification, that a state could nullify a federal statute. He was talking about tariffs primarily. Now we're talking about the concept that some state official can nullify the Constitution of the United States. Now, the Constitution of the United States, of course, requires all state officials, governors included, to take an oath to support the Constitution. That's her oath. Is she supporting the Constitution by nullifying the part of the Constitution? Oh, well, then she comes back to the point, I would imagine, that her oath of office at the federal level, Article 6 of the U.S. Constitution, is also not absolute. Well, is that true of all governors and all public officials in the states? I mean, was John C. Calhoun right? Was Jefferson Davis right? I mean, that's what we're getting at, right? So one wonders. I think this is a product of people that get into public office and they assume that once they're in public office, whatever their personal likes or dislikes may be, they are entitled to legislate those, or in this case, to order those, dictate those through some kind of executive promulgation. And public office is really something that sets them above and aside from the limitations of the law that put them in public office to begin with. Well, that's the ultimate, dictator's argument or tyrant's argument. Once I'm there, once you people foolishly have put me in this position, then I can do anything I want.
Yeah, under the cloak of a mandate. I have the people's mandate, and to be me and to do whatever I want, to say whatever I want, and to require them to do whatever they want.
Right. Although the people's mandate is for you to do what's in this document called the Constitution or the legislative code, which may apply to your actions, as to which you have taken an oath to support or follow or enforce or whatever the language may be. And then you get out of that by saying, well, your oath isn't absolute, which follows that those statutory limitations are not absolute, which follows that the constitutional limitations on which the statutes are based are not absolute, which means you can do anything you want. Well, all right. That's the predicate of the thing she's putting forward. And I can imagine why the Attorney General of the state would say, well, he's not going along with that. That's an impossibility. It's a logical impossibility. It's a legal impossibility. And then you wonder, how did the people of that state elect this woman? Didn't somebody realize what her attitudes were going to be, or were? Has she never expressed this concept in the past? So I don't think it's a question of serious nature, given the recent Supreme Court decision in the Bruin case, right? The Bruin case, New York Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin, which was dealing with the New York City, basically New York State, New York City, limitations on concealed carry of firearm. I think it was just carry. It wasn't necessarily on your person. You could have the gun in a car driving off to a range or something, and you were still controlled by these regulations. But in any event, outside of your home. And the Supreme Court struck that thing down and said, wait a minute, that doesn't comport with what they call the historical tradition of regulation of firearms. And it's interesting because they kind of fudged that. The historical tradition of the regulation of firearms at the time of the Second Amendment, not later on, but at the time of the Second Amendment, when the thing was written, you look at the law at the time it was written, and everyone who was of age, 15 or 16 years of age, up to whatever, 55, 60 years of age, when they became too old, was required to have a firearm for militia service, unless you were a Quaker or Mennonite, one of the pacifist religions. And there were no limitations whatsoever in all of those statutes which made the requirement of firearms ownership mandatory, that an individual couldn't carry those arms with him wherever he went. I mean, I've never seen provisions like that during that time. So if the Bruin case is relevant to this situation, then obviously the governor is entirely wrong. There's no authority whatsoever. Forget everything else I've said about the predicate for it. Just that one decision of the Supreme Court, which came out, a year ago? I don't know, not pretty recently. That one decision of the Supreme Court is absolutely contradictory of what she's done. So it would follow that any federal court would strike down her action. And I would imagine any state court would too, because the state court's going to be bound by the Second Amendment as well as the federal court would be. So the judicial lifespan of this case from the governor is highly, highly limited. But the problem is that this mindset is not. This is the same mindset, not quite as blatant as was apparent in the first COVID episode. And a lot of it was done sort of interstitially, where you'd have various public officials in the states, let's say public health officials. New York, to a large extent, it was the governor then, was named Cuomo, who was bragging about what he was doing. They would put pressure, positive or negative, on the hospitals, on the physicians, on the nursing homes in Cuomo's case, right? And nobody really stood up and said, well, wait a minute, do you have this authority? We're not going to go along with this. I think the physicians, to a large extent, who wanted to use alternative approaches to dealing with the so-called virus, the ivermectin people, the hydroxychloroquine people, so forth and so on, which it turned out were effective, right? If they were used at appropriately time and so forth. They were essentially terrorized by the potential loss of their certifications or their medical licenses. Pharmacists, doctors, right? So no one came along and said quite blatantly what this governor is saying, but they were doing the same thing, effectively. In fact, at a higher level, because when you arrived at the vaccination with these mystery serums that the various pharmaceutical companies put out, and people were saying, well, you're not going to be allowed to continue to be in the armed services. You're not going to be allowed to continue in this particular job. You're not going to be allowed to be hired. Maybe you're not going to be allowed to go into certain stores because the stores would decide that if you weren't vaccinated. All of that was done without any recognition that they had this much bigger problem. It's a constitutional problem. I think it's a lot higher than that you can't force people into participating in a medical experiment. You can't force people into participating into any kind of medical activity without informed consent. And that's exactly what was being done. And one would look at that in the United States Constitution and say, well, that's clearly a violation of due process, for heaven's sake. This extremely broad concept. And then on the other hand, they had suppression of various kinds of speech. People questioning the way that the deaths were reported, people questioning the subsidies that were being given to hospitals for treating cases as COVID cases when maybe they weren't. And of course, everything that was done in questioning the efficacy, testing and so forth of the so-called vaccines. And we now know that a lot of that was being done behind the scenes by government pressure on the media, government pressure on the internet platforms, whatever. Right? All of it raising First Amendment problems, profound First Amendment problems. Well, all of this was done, if you remember the first COVID era, on the basis of what? An emergency. Right? This thing came out of nowhere. And number two, public health. And they tied the two together, even though the effect of a lot of the things they were doing was actually undermining or contradicting sound public health procedures. So once they get the bit in the teeth, these horses run amok. They run wild. That raises the interesting question of maybe what was going on there in New Mexico is kind of a shot across the bow. Now, let's see what happens if we take a fairly extreme position, whoever is behind this governor, we take a fairly extreme position on the use of emergency powers coupled with public health, and we tie it to some other issue that's highly controversial. How far can we push this? Or should I put it the other way? What kind of negative feedback are we going to receive? What will be the pushback on us? And I think they discovered one thing, that when they couple this emergency powers public health theory to the Second Amendment, they receive a tremendous pushback. However, one can say that doesn't mean they would stop in the future. I mean, her theory was pretty bad because it was the public health emergency was the use of firearms by, I'm assuming, criminal elements. All right, and that just doesn't fly as a logical matter, right? Any more than public health is tied to people recklessly driving automobiles or something, or maybe not recklessly, just having accidents. But on the other hand, the way these people think, the ones who are trying to exercise more and more dictatorial power, to expand on their ability to do that, well, they test the waters. How far can we go? What kind of feedback do we get? How do we need to tailor our argument in the future so that we'll have less resistance and perhaps more support? And that's interesting because obviously there's some talk floating around about some new COVID episode. Masking is now becoming a question. Perhaps the possibility of lockdowns in some cases. Oh my goodness, we're going to go back to that again after so much has been proven untrue in the first episode. So what are they doing? Well, maybe they're testing to see the extent to which people are not paying attention to the exposures that have been made of the first go-around. And maybe that's what this is about. And I don't know. It's strange because that state has nothing in comparison with respect to gun deaths, gun violence, right? Violence perpetrated by somebody with a firearm, as cities like Chicago. Could they pass? Well, of course, Chicago has pretty drastic gun laws to begin with, but could they outlaw in Illinois? Could the governor of Illinois, Pritzker's just signed some very draconian assault weapons ban there? Could he just declare, on the basis that Chicago has a public health crisis because so many children are being killed, gang violence, but they're still children, they're maybe under 16 years of age. So many children are being killed with firearms that he could simply declare across the entire state of Illinois that all firearms are banned, and it's a public health emergency? So you can imagine somebody thinking along those lines. And there's the problem, because a lot of people in this country accept the concept of emergency powers because it seems intuitively correct. When an emergency occurs, somebody has to be able to deal with that set of circumstances. Of course, it might not necessarily be a public official at all. Right? It might be a public official different from the one who's claiming that emergency power within that state. It might not even be a state public official at all. It might be some public official at the national level. But everyone intuitively kind of accepts this concept. And then, unfortunately, the average person doesn't ask the question, well, assuming that there might be some set of circumstances that would justify somebody in taking it, do we have those circumstances now? Do we have some basis in the present set of statutes or constitutional provisions, perhaps in our state, that gives this official that authority under this set of facts? And if not, then what's actually going on here? Maybe it's some other official that should be doing it. Maybe it's no official that should be doing it. Maybe if it's a really serious matter, we need to pass a statute to allow it to be done, or a constitutional provision to allow it to be done. But we don't simply accept that this is the way things should operate simply because some public official declares a so-called emergency. And I just point out to people, look at the Constitution of the United States, see if you find the word emergency. I mean, a lot of words that relate to powers, they're all defined in some way. But there's no emergency power, just in those terms, let alone with a bunch of definitions attached to it. And the word emergency is not used. In fact, if you look at one, I suppose, that would be considered kind of an emergency power, the suspension of the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus, it says that shan't be done unless there's invasion or rebellion, right? And who decides that? Well, that's Congress. So you'd have to have somebody decide that those facts existed for this thing, the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus, to be allowable. And that clearly is what anyone would call an emergency situation, because the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus allows the police, let's say, whoever would be the enforcement authority, to put people into jail, and the courts could not let them out, even if they were held in jail on basically unconstitutional theory. All right? So that's a pretty broad power. And it says, well, it shall not be exercised unless, and then it gives the two circumstances on which it can be exercised. And that, of course, brings you back to the definition of those terms, which brings you back ultimately to some kind of judicial inquiry, at least. Whether the authorities would go along with is another question, but at least some kind of judicial inquiry. So that's what I want to hear. With the average person has never thought this thing through and never asked the questions, oh, governor's exercising emergency powers, where's that in the Constitution? Where's that in statutes that grant the governor particular authority? And are there conditions, even if it's called an emergency, are there particular conditions, requirements, limitations that are attached to the governor's exercising that power? So I think most people have looked at this business with the governor's ban in kind of a simplistic way, because it's, oh, well, this thing violates Second Amendment because it has to do with guns. Oh, all right. But there's a lot more to it. Obviously, it violates the Second Amendment. The governor cannot set aside any provision of the Constitution of the United States, period, end of discussion. But that's just kind of the simple-minded approach to it. Leaving that aside, all of this other business ought to be considered. Where does she think she gets this emergency power? What part of the public health code, if there is such a thing, to which the governor is an appendage in some way, in which the governor can exercise some authority, relates to this concept of the use of firearms? By the way, by law-abiding citizens, because I'm sure the governor has plenty of law enforcement, or the police or whatever below the governor, have plenty of law enforcement authority to deal with the illegal use of firearms that result in death or bodily injury. Right? Murder, aggravated assault, you can think of all sorts of manslaughter, you can think of all sorts of statutes that would be out there that would be subject to prosecution, either at the state level or the county level, however they're set up, whatever jurisdiction would have particular control. And nobody seems to be laying all of that out, saying, wait a minute, the first one is obvious, the Second Amendment one is obvious, but let's get down to the state level, and let's see how this proclamation works as an exercise of this particular governor's powers under this state's constitution, under this state's statutes, especially with relation to these two generalized concepts, emergency and public health. And that's where I would think that you're going to go through and find, wait a minute, there's just no way you can make this out, because here's the way the statutes work. And they require this, that, and the other thing, and your definition, ultimately definition of public health, is going to be something to deal with disease or contaminated water or whatever, and not some implement that people may use criminally or negligently to harm other people. I mean, if that were the case, then almost anything, crowbar, screwdriver, flat iron, something that someone could use as an instrument of battery, for instance, all of that would be anything in the criminal code would be regulated that related to personal harm, personal injury of one kind or another. The entire criminal code would be subject to this. And you start asking yourself, well, how is that rational? I would think most lawyers would look askance at it and say, well, there'd be a heck of a lot to prove here if you went through the criminal code to justify this kind of action as a generality. But as I say, the problem that we have in this country is people are not, it's because of the educational process, people are not legally minded, especially with respect to limitations. I think most people think in terms of the powers of the governor, the powers of the legislature, the powers of the regulators. They can do this as a practical matter. They do these things. And the average person doesn't ask, well, is that legitimate? Does the governor have the legitimate power to do this? He may have the raw, naked power, if you will, the physical power, because he sends the police or something to coerce someone. But the question always arises, does he have the legal power? And unfortunately, that tends to be settled years after the event in some court case by some individual who has been harmed and had the wherewithal in terms of money and lawyers and so forth to litigate the question all the way to whatever level, state Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court, whatever was the final judicial authority. And then we find out years later that what was done way back here was wrong, at least with respect to that individual. It might have harmed a number of other individuals who didn't get into court for one reason or another. And he receives what? He receives some monetary compensation paid for by whom? The taxpayers. Generally speaking, not paid by the wrongdoer, the public official. So it's basically a screwed up system, because the people who can do the most harm tend to have some kind of practical or legal immunity. And I always think of this in terms of I don't imagine anything's happened under this governor's ukase that anyone has been arrested, given the attitude of the attorney general, given the attitude of that one sheriff and probably other sheriffs around that jurisdiction, or touching near that jurisdiction. So it's probably a non-entity, legally speaking. They'd sue the governor and get what? An injunction against her, writ of prohibition, right? Telling her you can't do this anymore. this is illegal, you can't do it, you can't attempt to enforce it. I don't know even whether they would make her pay attorney's fees. Probably, I can imagine a federal civil rights lawsuit where she wouldn't be able to raise an immunity defense because this is an issue which no one could dispute, that no governor has the power to set aside the Second Amendment. So she'd probably end up paying at least attorney's fees for somebody sued her, personally paying attorney's fees. But the generality here is that most public officials have some kind of qualified immunity from personal lawsuits. And generally, if they lose that, they have some way that the state ends up paying the damages. So state or county ends up paying the damages. And that's a peculiarity because, of course, if you look at physicians, lawyers, accountants, I don't know, maybe real estate agents, there are a number of professions out there that certainly can be sued for malpractice, which is what politicians are sued for when they violate the Constitution or other laws. And those people don't have any kind of qualified immunity, right? What do they have to do? They have to come up with personal liability insurance to cover them for their acts of malpractice. Now, who can do more damage? A physician harms his one patient. A lawyer might harm his one client or group of clients in a particular lawsuit. Same with accountants. A real estate agent will make some real blunder and fouls up some real estate deal, causing damage to people, monetary damage to people. It's a limited set of victims in any case, because if you have a doctor time and again engage in malpractice, or a lawyer time and again engage in malpractice, pretty soon somebody complains to the regulatory authority or the state bar, and those people lose their licenses to practice at all. Right? So they're removed from the system. It doesn't go on indefinitely. But you think of a politician, a person in public office, how much damage can be done by an unconstitutional or otherwise illegal act? A huge amount of damage, all the way up to the possibility of starting a war. If we go all the way to the President of the United States, right? Starting nuclear war. And the extent of that damage, how many people could be harmed and to what degree? Well, you can imagine certain circumstances. Yet, the people who can cause the most damage are the ones who have the most legal immunity and other kinds of what I would call fatuous defenses. And I always think of the rule going way back about keeping wild animals as pets. And the rule was, well, if you keep a wild animal as a pet, you become an insurer to the entire world. Because wild animals are notorious for their viciousness, for their unpredictability, for their ability to do tremendous amounts of harm in short periods of time. And therefore, you keep a tiger or a lion or whatever in a cage as a pet, and somehow that animal escapes. Bolt of lightning comes down from the sky, and the cage springs open. The lion, the tiger runs down the street and mauls a little blind girl in the wheelchair. You, as the keeper of that, have no defense. Doesn't matter there was a bolt of lightning, an act of God. Doesn't matter that cage you had was the top of the line. It went even beyond what's considered to be state-of-the-art. The tiger mauled a little blind girl. It was your tiger. It was a wild animal. You're liable. End of discussion. And obviously, you're probably not going to be able to get any kind of animal insurance in that type of situation. It'd be very, very difficult, or the rates would be sky high. But I've always thought, well, that's the rule that should be applied to public officials. What public officials do is a lot akin to keeping wild animals in a cage. They can do tremendous amount of damage in a very short period of time, and often for the very wrong reasons. The man keeping the tiger in the cage was trying very hard to keep the tiger in the cage. We find public officials all the time, kind of stretching their authority, if you will, if not completely disregarding the limits on their authority for political reasons, personal reasons, God knows what reasons, right? But not reasons that are justifiable in the long run. They don't try to remain within the cage of their own limitations, as this woman governor said. Right? Her oath of office is not absolute. Oh, yeah, well, the cage that she has around her can open up very easily. The lock doesn't work. She can get out. The wild animal can get out at any point in time, according to her. But why isn't she personally liable? Personally liable to whatever degree. Now, in this particular case, I doubt that there's some statute that imposes a fine on her as far as state law, but I would hope that there would be. That would be one of the first things if I were the emperor of the universe and I was in the state legislature. I'd, well, this is what we're going to have. You step one angstrom over the line, and the penalty is a $100,000 fine. End of discussion. No immunity, no nothing. And that might cut out a lot of foolishness by these people. But that doesn't exist. Why? Because the legislators would be in the same boat, ultimately. So, they're all in the game together. But I think this is an example of it. This is an example of there being no real repercussions here. The governor goes and does something which is an obvious violation of the U.S. Constitution, over which she has no authority whatsoever. She cannot claim any kind of emergency power, public health related or otherwise, over the Constitution of the United States. So what in heaven's name does she think she's doing? Well, she's like a czarina, right? It's the absolutism of the czarina, Catherine the Great, I guess, the example, right? Last czarina they had. Absolute power. Well, interesting enough, even the czar didn't have absolute power. Absolutism was really not absolute, as it turned out in 1917. Actually, as it turned out in other instances as well, where the czars had to back off from certain actions they were going to take because the boyars, the important people in society, were not in complete agreement with them. But that's what I don't understand here, why somebody doesn't look right away and say, this kind of action by an official at that level certainly raises the question of disqualification. Right? They're talking about investigating Biden because of corrupt practices. That's what I understand it. Basically it is, right? Receiving money for favors, exercise of his authority, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, fine, that's bad enough. Maybe that's bribery, extortion, whatever. So those are impeachable offenses. But they're basically just at the lower level than somebody completely disregarding the limits on her authority. Now, the Biden charges, I guess you say, well, if it's true, if these allegations are proven, then yes, he's exceeding limitations on his authority. But it's not the same as saying she has no limitations on her authority. All right? And I would think if someone's going to be impeached for an action that is clearly at the very high level, of the impeachment list, that what this governor did is probably one of those acts, because she justifies it by this claim that her oath of office is not absolute. Well, if it's not absolute, and who decides what the level of absolute nature is, right? She does, right? If I say my limitations on my authority are not absolute, who's going to decide those situations in which those limitations are not absolute? Well, I will. So I'm going to define my own authority, and by hypothesis, because the limitations are not absolute, potentially my authority is limitless. Well, I don't know. You can think of any recent dictator. I mean, even Mao Zedong claimed that somehow or other the Central Committee of the Stalin claimed the same. The Politburo, right? He was only one member of the Politburo. He never claimed to be an absolute dictator. Maybe Hitler did, but he was last stages. I think he was probably demented. We're trying to think of the great, in a historical sense, dictators of the 20th century, and all of them were going on the basis. In fact, even Hitler, because Hitler was going on the basis that the army had sworn an oath to him personally, right? So even he could come back and say, "Well, hey, wait a minute, you did this over here, and therefore you have to obey my orders. I have some I have some tie on you in that way. But he never claimed that personally he had any limitations on his authority. He never recognized limitations on his authority. Stalin may have, in principle, because they had a constitution that he wrote, or someone wrote for him in the middle 30s. And so he always pretended to be something other than an absolute dictator. But I remember there's this story, I think it's true. He's visiting his mother in Georgia, in Goree, his birthplace. His mother's an old woman. And she asks him, Yosef, what is it you do there in Moscow? And he said, I'm like the Tsar. Right? I'm like the Tsar who claimed absolutism, absolute power. And his mother is supposed to have said, well, you would have done better to have become a priest. Because he was in the seminary. He was in an Russian Orthodox seminary for several years before he started reading forbidden Marxist literature and became a revolutionary. But that was his attitude. I'm something like the Tsar. Well, that's true. That's the way he functioned. He was something like the Tsar. He claimed absolute power, and anyone that got on the wrong side of him ended up in a gulag or perhaps worse. So that's what I find interesting about this, and maybe a little bit frightening about it, because it doesn't take people back to the first principles here. That public officials, or let me put it this way, public officials, people in positions of public office, are not actually functioning as part of the government, except to the extent that they obey their limitations. As soon as they go outside, and the Supreme Court has said, the U.S. Supreme Court has said this on a number of occasions, as soon as a public official steps outside of the ambit of his legitimate authority, defined by statute or ultimately by a constitution, then he is simply a private wrongdoer. He is not a public official with respect to that activity. He is a private wrongdoer. And that is why public officials cannot partake of the concept of sovereign immunity, because they're not acting as the sovereign. They're acting as a private wrongdoer, and therefore they can be sued. And that's why we have statutes, certainly at the federal level. 42 U.S.C. 1983 deals with state officials who act under color of law in violation of someone's constitutional rights, or criminal statutes. 18 U.S.C., Title 18 of the United States Code, Sections 241, 242, who deal with people who are acting to violate people's civil rights. Actually, that also covers private parties as well as government officials. But this whole concept of color of law, you can be acting under color of law because you are in some official position and you're playing some game with a proclamation as a governor or whatever you were going to call it, executive order, whatever it is. But when one looks at that actual action that you've taken, it's easy to determine that it violates a statute or it violates a constitutional provision, and therefore it's all invalid. And you, in taking that action, although it's under color of law, it's not under the auspices of law, if you will. You become a private malefactor, private wrongdoer, and then you are subject to certain kinds of penalties as statutorily prescribed. And I would think that would be the first thing that someone would say here. Well, we have an obvious Title 42, Section 1983 violator, this governor. Clear as could be, setting aside the Second Amendment as a governor. Right? It's questionable enough as to whether Congress could do it with the president passing some gun control statute, or whether whether the president could do it through executive order. I think that's an impossibility. Or people are also debating the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Agency, which keeps coming up with these new interpretations, these new rule-making exercises, where it changes its interpretation of the statute under which it's operating. And one would say, well, you can't do that either. Your existence and your authority and your ability to do this, that, or the other thing depend upon conformity with this statute, just as the president's authority and Congress's authority depend upon conformity. Well, the president's authority also depends upon conformity with various statutes, but both Congress and the president and the ATF, for heaven's sake, have to conform at the top level with the Constitution of the United States. I mean, nobody doubts this. And the ATF's argument, the argument on one side is, well, you're going beyond your authority. And the ATF says, oh, no, we're interpreting this language consistent with the authority. Even they attempt to conform what they're doing to their statutory mandate. They don't say, oh, well, our power as an executive agency is not limited by the oaths we take or the statutes we take. Those things are not absolute. We can invent additions or subtractions, whatever, to these statutory requirements and come up with new regulations on our own because we think it's a good idea. Well, that's what this governor is doing. It's a good idea. And she's going to connect to, or I suppose they could be connected in some way, emergency and public health. I could imagine statutes that would, assuming the legislature has this power, assuming the state legislature is not bound in some way by the Constitution, the state legislature could come up with an emergency statute defining what the emergency is in relationship to an actual public health situation, and there would be a number of what I would call factual hoops that the governor would have to jump through before there could be an executive order, defining some activity that was proscribed. But this thing's impossible. Absolutely impossible. And I'm just surprised I haven't heard the word impeachment yet. Maybe I'm just not looking at the right internet sites.
Well, you had mentioned early on in your exposition here the parallels between this claiming of emergency powers in the name of public health with what we've all endured and we've suffered at, and some people have lost their lives over. Certainly, many have lost their businesses, their senior year in high school, and on over the last 3 years related to a public health crisis. It's not the only issues that have been tied to that. There have been so gun violence being claimed as justifying a public health emergency, or virus being claimed as a public health justifying a public health emergency. We've heard of hate speech crimes that intimidate and can cause suicide, or this and that being examples of things that could create a public health emergency. We've heard of climate issues that can be claimed. So it seems that we have a model here, as you're saying, as far as a playbook being run, whether it's on a trial basis or to test and improve the model, that where there's a holy grail in the middle called a public health emergency. And if you can justify that, if you can claim that you've identified one, or you can put a pin on the map and say, there's a public health emergency, whether it's for gun violence, climate control, virus, hate speech, whatever, then there's this cornucopia of assumed powers that can be enacted, such as lockdowns, medical mandates, Second Amendment suspension, censorship of speech, suspending licenses. Contact tracing is one thing that you didn't mention. That was also Bill Clinton came out quite forcefully advocating for that early in the COVID era. Was we need to have a fully functional, robust, nationwide or even international contact tracing system in the name of public health. So, and when we interviewed McAdams, what's his first name? I'll have to think of it in a minute, from the Ron Paul Institute on about the Patriot Act. He said the Patriot Act is the cancer in our body politic as far as all of the abrogations of our constitutional rights that it seems to interfere with or set aside in the name of dealing with a declared emergency. So we seem to rotate from time to time what's going to be the emergency of the decade, as far as whether it's going to be terrorism or whatever else. But it seems now this latest one that's getting a lot of versatile application is this concept of a public health emergency. You've done a fabulous job of demonstrating that it's not listed in the Constitution as as a thing that somehow sets aside powers or grants any new or sets aside limitations on power or grants any new powers. But you've also broadened that shine a bright light on the fact that anyone in a position of authority who claims that they are going to grant themselves assume additional authority and point to that as their sort of their virtue signaling rationalization for how they can do that. But there doesn't seem to be any limitations on it. And anyone who challenges that can be called up, either be censored or punished for speaking out against, in the name of protecting public health. Your voice must be silenced. And that's certainly, we've seen a lot of that.
Well, see, that's a limitation that's right there. That is, some official comes along and says, I have an emergency power with respect, let's say, to public health. And the limitation on that is the First Amendment, when someone says, number one, you don't, and I'll tell you why. And then secondly, someone or a group of people get together and say, well, we're going to seek redress of grievances by going to the legislature or going to the courts to deal with this problem. So those limitations are there. Now, what happened in the first COVID era was they tried, to a large extent successfully, to thwart those limitations, right? Attacking people on the basis that their speech was misinformation, disinformation, whatever. You can't question Dr. Fauci. You can't question Governor Cuomo, etc., right? So they removed, or attempted to remove, some of the limitations on their excessive assertions of authority. Now, public health is the most dangerous predicate for all of this because, unlike terrorism, gun violence, and you run a list of other horribles, everyone is concerned with his or her own health. Right? We all don't imagine that terrorists are going to bomb our workplaces, or that someone is going to shoot us, in Walmart. Although, of course, that's always a possibility. But we do have every minute of our lives some concern or consideration, at least, for the maintenance of our own personal health. So if that can be ginned up into a kind of terroristic theory, that is to terrorize someone, right? You become terrorized about what's going to happen to your own health because of, and then here's the list of horribles: gun violence, climate change, mysterious viruses, what have you, all the way down the list. Now, of course, with the gun violence, you have a large segment of the population that is fairly well organized in opposition. Right? The gun owners have large organizations, and they pretty much pay attention to what goes on, and they're not easily cowed. They're much more likely to say, no, we won't comply, or yes, we're going to go to court 5 minutes after this executive order is passed, right? But when you get into some of these other areas, especially public health, because people still tend to hold physicians and pharmacists and then the nursing profession, the hospitals and so forth and so on, in relatively high esteem, although from what we've seen in the first COVID episode, maybe that should be questioned somewhat. And number two, everyone is concerned about his own health. And number three, a lot of these health-related issues, we'll call them, are beyond the normal area of intellectual competence, let's say, let alone, workplace competence of the average person. The average person is probably not capable of reading some scientific paper full of jargon about, the fact that during the first COVID episode, the common flu disappeared apparently, and it was all those cases were considered to be COVID cases. Right? That there was kind of faked reporting or fixed reporting on the number of COVID cases, COVID deaths, COVID infections, whatever, that whole business. He couldn't do that by himself while that was happening. Later on, he can read some article that's produced by someone who has digested that material and presented it to him in a fashion that he can understand. But when it was happening, he couldn't, right? So now we have the situation with the COVID thing especially, that it has been exposed that a lot of what went on there was, shall we say, less than credible in different ways. And people are now sort of awakening to the fact that they have to be a little bit more skeptical of what comes out of the official mouthpieces and what comes out of the media. Well, but, that's going to depend upon the level of hysteria that's created. right? Then the next public health crisis will make COVID look like a mild cold or something, right? Kill 90% of the population if you all don't take 20 shots in an hour, whatever the heck it may be. So we run into that, in a sense, it's a kind of cycle or circle that, I think most people looking back, or a lot of people looking back and say, well, we were kind of duped about that first COVID episode. But then what happens when the next episode, whether it's COVID or something else, is driven to a higher level of hysteria by the public officials and the media, and people really don't know how to respond to it because they're telling you, these higher levels are telling you, you will be hospitalized, you will die, whatever it is, unless you do these things. And that's been proven by Dr. whoever in the FDA. And of course, anyone who doubts this will be considered to be himself a public health threat. Right? What do they call them? The vaccine deniers. And a lot of those people weren't vaccine deniers. They were vaccine skeptics who said, well, does this thing really work? Has this really been tested? How do we know? Are you giving us complete information so that we can actually consent to taking these things? And then, of course, we discover that all those questions were never answered appropriately. Right? So there's a difficulty. It depends on what level of public awareness. And I think the Second Amendment's an interesting one because they'd love to be able to suppress the Second Amendment simply by saying, well, there are a number of people who die as a result of violence with guns, or a number of people who die as a result of accidents with guns, or a number of people who die as a result of suicide with guns, whatever. You go down that list of causes of death, of types of death caused by, or in which a firearm was involved, right? And they say all of these things, suicide, that's public health, right? Oh, yeah, well, mental health maybe. What has a gun got to do with it? A person kills himself. It's not because of the gun. It's because of the mental health issue. They might poison themselves. They might hang themselves, whatever, drown themselves. A gun happens. Well, the average, there's a difference between women and men. Women tend to take poison. Men tend to shoot themselves. So what are we to say there? I mean, it gets very complicated. But you can see that the people who want to suppress the private ownership of firearms would love to be able to tie it to public health in such a way that huge swaths of the community become hysterical about the presence of guns in the hands of their neighbors. Right? I can't trust my neighbor with a gun because of public health problem. He may go insane or whatever. Okay. Now, as I say, they're not going to get away with that because there are too many people organized on the pro-Second Amendment side. But the public health side is the one that worries me most because you don't have, they're starting. There was the Great Barrington Group and so forth and so on that were questioning from way back the original COVID narrative and vaccine narrative, and a lot of what they said has been proven absolutely true. And you'd need organizations like that and a high level in terms of numbers of people who were involved in them or listening to them, and the amount of money they could spend in terms of some kind of media presence. So the gun people already have that to a large degree. The public health people, well, I'm not so sure. And that's the problem because the public health issue is one that touches everybody. Right? Not everybody has a gun. Not everybody's living in inner city Chicago where he's worried about maybe his children being shot at school over a drug deal or whatever. But everyone is worried about his health. And it's a complicated enough situation where the average person is going to be, at least initially, unsure that those people telling him from the higher levels of the state or federal public health bureaucracy, he's going to be unsure whether they're right. And then what's his choice? All right. Assume that they're wrong on the basis of some fragmentary information that he has and things that he may not really understand, and then contract the disease and be crippled or die, or believe these people, take the vaccine or whatever, do the masking, do the lockdowns, and maybe be safe. And I'll give you the example of somebody who is exposed to rabies. And let's assume it's not a clear case of exposure, but there's a possibility of exposure. Well, there's no test for rabies. You can't take a blood sample after someone has come in contact with a rabid raccoon or whatever and determine, this person, yes, has sufficient amount of rabies virus in him so that he needs to take the inoculation. No. What happens? The person who has been exposed to an equivocal set of circumstances, he takes the inoculation, right? Now, with the rabies inoculation, that's very, very safe and very, very effective. We know that because it's been tried and proved true over a long period of time. So you're not necessarily risking anything to a serious degree if you take it. But if you don't take it, then the risk is potentially deadly because it doesn't necessarily show up within 2 or 3 weeks. It could be months. There are cases where it hasn't shown up for a year or more. So a person in that situation where he doesn't know, there's a potential risk, and over here are the experts telling him, well, this treatment is going to protect you, will of course go into the hospital and take the rabies shot. I think he'd be reckless not to do that. Well, we have the same thing here with some of these pandemic issues. The average person is faced with a claim that he's been exposed or will be exposed to some deadly virus. And once that happens, oh my goodness, all bets are off. You'll be in the hospital, you'll be on a ventilator, you'll be taking remdesivir or whatever, you'll die. And over here we have the experts telling them, oh, well, if you take the latest version of this mRNA virus vaccine, antivirus vaccine, then, yeah, we think you'll be fine. Well, we haven't run the tests. When we did run some tests, all the ferrets died, whatever. But we think it's good. And the only people who are questioning that are the ones who are being suppressed on the Internet as purveyors of disinformation. And they're individual physicians or they're a small group of whatever. And they may have all sorts of credentials, but they're not sitting in these official positions. And so what's the average person going to do? He's going to go along with that. Oh, that's fine. And that, I think, is a great danger because once you get that inculcated in people's minds, that public health justifies any kind of directive coming out of public officials who claim to be authorized to make those. And that could be simply a governor. Doesn't even have to be a public health official. Cuomo is the example, right? He was doing all sorts of things that I doubt, he probably had complete authority to do under their public health law. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't, but it certainly seemed like he was taking, actions pretty much on his own initiative. And what's the average person going to do? It's like the rabies shot. What's he going to do? Is he going to take the chance on the basis of his imperfect or complete lack of knowledge? Or is he going to follow the directive of these people who, at this point in time, appear to be knowledgeable and acting in, quote-unquote, the public interest, whatever that may be? Now, later on, we discovered, number one, there's a theory that the danger was hyped beyond proportion. And number two, that the people in the positions of the public health administration were telling us things that either were inaccurate or were known to be untrue. And they were doing this in the interest of their own power or perhaps their relationship to, various private companies or go into all of that that's been exposed with respect to the first COVID event. And then the person's stuck. Well, he took the shots. Then he ends up with heart problems or worse, drops dead. Too bad for him, right? And those are all, as Dr. Fauci would say, anecdotal, right? They're not coming up with studies demonstrating that these people were getting, I guess some studies are now beginning to appear, but they poo-pooed this for a very long time. Oh, the fact that they're getting myocarditis, it has nothing to do with the vaccine, blah, 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 blah. Now we're discovering, well, maybe it does. Okay. And that's another example of what I pointed out before, that the harm occurs here at this point in time, and much, much later is the harm exposed in terms of who's responsible for it. And then much, much later beyond that is someone actually held accountable in a court of law. Because none of them have been held accountable in a court of law, as far as I can tell, for the COVID event, even the ones that were grossly perverting the line that they were presenting to the general public. Nobody has been sued for this. And what are we talking about? We're talking 2020, 2024, 4 years or 6 years. After a while, the statute of limitations runs out, and then they can't be sued. So this is the difficulty. And the public health one is one in which this difficulty reaches what I would say the apogee, simply because of the disconnect between the knowledge of Ma and Pa Kettle, the average American, their medical knowledge, and the perceived knowledge of the public official, not this governor that we're talking about here. I think this is nonsense, connecting guns to public health. But you take the Cuomo situation. He was on, almost every day, pontificating about this, that, and the other thing. They gave him an Emmy with respect to some book that he put together about his participation as a leader, opinion maker, or whatever in the COVID matter. And I guess they took that away from him after the sex allegations were brought against him. But for a while, he was like the poster child of this. Here's the governor. I have all these powers. Here's this public health emergency. I'm doing all these things. And I'm coming on every day telling you what I'm doing. And you're sitting back lapping this up and accepting it as justified. Until finally the business with the nursing homes in particular came out. And then there were questions. And has anyone been held accountable for the nursing home problem? That's kind of a rhetorical question. I don't know the answer to it. I certainly haven't heard that any public official has been, charged in some way. Maybe they've made deals with the families of the people who died, right? Settled cases and so forth. So the cases were brought and they were settled for some monetary amount, and both sides agreed, that they'd be kept under wraps, right? But I would think it would have gone to a higher level than that. 15,000, some people, close to 16,000 people die, and nobody, for any reason, has a criminal charge of any kind brought against him. That's amazing. Now, maybe it's justified. I don't know. I mean, you get into the facts. But it would seem to me that there's kind of the example. People go through this episode, and then it's sort of bygones be bygones. Oh, yeah, Ma and Pa Kettle, Uncle Fred, they died in the nursing home. Well, okay. And maybe that was a mistake or whatever. We'll just let that go until the next time it happens. And it'll probably be more than 15,000 the next time. Or the masking thing. I mean, now I think it's been accepted pretty much that all of those masking decrees had no effect. And probably they were detrimental in one way or another. And yet there are people out there now asking for more masking on the basis of whatever this latest variant of COVID may be. So it never ends. This is my point. It never ends. There was always going to be a segment of the population, forget the ones who want to do this for nefarious reasons. There will be a segment of the population that will simply accept on the basis of some public health theory that's laid before them that they need to do A, B, C, and D. And they'll simply close their minds to contrary arguments where the people that they are actually listening to say, well, if you don't wear a mask, you're going to die, right? If you don't lock down, you're going to die. If you don't take the vaccine, you're going to die. Oh, my God, I'm going to die. Okay, I'm going to do those things. Why? Because I'm basically terrorized by the thought of death or severe bodily injury, and these are the authority figures over here. And so I've accepted this concept. I'm going to act in consistency with authority figures when I find myself in this threat situation, for which, unfortunately, I don't have the education and the competence to make a judgment on my own. In fact, even to the point of making a judgment as to whether I should accept these authority figures or whether I should accept Dr. Zelenko, if I can use him, the late Dr. Zelenko, as an example of the contrarian, who said, use this other procedure, it's worked for my patients, it'll work for you. No, I'm not going to talk about doctors. I'm not going to accept Dr. Zelenko. Even if they allow Dr. Zelenko and people such as Dr. Zelenko to be on the internet platforms, to be presented in the mass media, to be on MSNBC, whatever, CNN, which, of course, they didn't do. Dr. Zelenko was suppressed. He couldn't get his information out. But the average person, even if he had the access to Dr. Zelenko, he would probably accept this authority figure because the authority figure is sitting in this position of what? Of authority. This is the problem. We don't understand the Constitution and even statutes are designed to limit, confine, cabin, crib, control authority. And so you have to be always suspicious of people in authority when they begin taking actions that look as if they're premised on what they call emergency powers. Right? Because as soon as that word is used, I think the average person should be beginning to say, well, there's something wrong here. If this fellow can't point to some specific authority he has, he's creating this penumbral event. Penumbras and emanations was, I think that was Justice Douglas. Said, well, there are penumbras and emanations in the Constitution. They're not written down. Actually, he was saying that with respect to rights. He's saying, well, some of these rights have penumbras and emanations that extend beyond the literal terms. And he wasn't extending it to governmental power, but the people in authority are always talking about penumbras and emanations of expansions of their powers. And this word emergency is the one that they always use. Why? Because the average person understands the word emergency. In a vague way, something that happens, we weren't expecting it, something created a dangerous situation, and then you tie that with public health. As I said before, which I think is obvious, basically every person doesn't want to die, and he doesn't want to be severely injured. Probably doesn't want to be injured at all, but certainly doesn't want to die or be severely injured. That's concern number one. All right? And so you put those two things together, and it's very logical for the tyrannical mind to say, well, this is all I need to do. I'm in this position of authority. All I need to do is talk about emergency powers that I'm going to use to save this person's life, to save the average Joe's life, or to prevent him from becoming terribly ill, or what have you. So I'm going to create a kind of terroristic situation in order to compel him to accept my exertion of authority over him, even though if my exertion of authority over him were suitably investigated in a court where the constitutional facts would have to be determined to the satisfaction of the judiciary, right, which is at least preponderance of the evidence. And so I might bring in my experts, and the other side would bring in their experts, and there'd be a trial of experts here. But that's not what happens. We don't have that. In these situations, the facts are simply assumed by the person in authority, who then exerts the emergency powers doctrine on the premise that if it weren't done, those people as to whom he was acting and applying this power were going to die or be seriously injured. Those people will always at the beginning, accept that. I think it's just the nature of the average person to accept that. You have to either be a real constitutional lawyer who says, this fellow is exerting emergency powers, I know there's something wrong. Or you have to be someone who understands the medical aspect of the claimed exertion of power. To say, wait a minute, that's going too far, that doesn't have justification, whatever. We ought to wait and see before we do it. That's the minimum level. We ought to wait and see and have some study done before we give somebody these experimental drugs. Right? Because a person can't consent if we don't know enough about this drug and its effect. And all of that is swept away. And you saw that in the first COVID event. It was all swept away because the thing was generated on the basis of millions of people could die from this. And the average person said, oh, my God, yes. And so when he got a cold or he got a normal flu, immediately the thought was, oh, I have COVID. I'm one step away from the funeral home. I have to accept the mask. I have to accept the lockdown. I have to accept losing my business. I have to accept being drummed out of the armed forces because the alternative is this. And not necessarily to me, but necessarily to someone else. You had that whole series of episodes that were occurring where people who were wearing masks were screaming at people who weren't. Right? And the people who weren't wearing masks or weren't abiding 100% by the lockdowns were considered to be public enemies. Right? Well, all of that is part of this, a small scale part of the scenario of the governor we're talking about, right? There's a public health problem, gun violence. Therefore, anyone who has a gun is potentially a public enemy. Therefore, I, the governor, can ban the possession of guns. It has a perverse logic about it. But it's the end of constitutional government, ultimately. You could say that it was the end of the constitutional government in the Patriot Act, although I don't think so, because the Patriot Act is not as broad as a lot of people say it is. And you could probably say, well, a lot of the end of constitutional government occurred under COVID, but maybe not quite, because very few people really pointed to the provisions of the Constitution that were being evaded or abrogated, right? But this one with the governor's case against gun possession, obviously you can. So this one goes a little bit further in its blatantness. But the whole concept, I think, we've seen before, and we're going to see it again. Because they can tie anything to public health, whether it's COVID, whether it's climate change. That's another one, too. Because now you have the problem of defining public health, and you have the problem of defining climate change. What changes in the climate are you talking about? How do they specifically affect public health? And how does this order coming out of whoever the official is prevent that harm from happening? Right? And as I say, any lawyer would look at this. How would you litigate this case? How would you challenge this case in court? And the point would be, well, you wouldn't accept the power of this official. First, you'd look and find where it exists, supposedly, in the Constitution and statutes. And then those powers would have, at least implicit in them, some definition of terms. And you'd ask, well, are you meeting this definition? And then there'd be some area of fact. Do we have the set of facts that come under this definition that justify this exercise of power? And those facts would be subject to litigation. As in any case, the facts are subject to litigation. You don't go into a court case and one side says, well, the facts have to be taken as true simply because I say so. The judge would say, well, wait a minute, I'm going to fine you. That's an improper argument for a lawyer to make. Both sides present their version of the facts, and then whoever is a trier of fact, whether that's a jury or in some cases a judge, decides which version of the facts is correct. And what we have in all these emergency power situations is the implicit notion that the person or office exercising that power has the right definitively to determine what the facts are without any challenge. And that's why if you challenge them, like Robert Kennedy Jr. did in his Children's Health Defense Fund organization, why he was pilloried and still is being pilloried for that, right? Nobody else is, and they haven't gotten to the fact yet, but yet to the point of saying, well, we're going to penalize you in a criminal sense, seriously. We're going to suppress you in other ways. But that's the ultimate logic of this situation. If you have the emergency power, and according to you, it fits this situation, then who's to determine the facts other than you? If you were to allow someone else to determine the facts, my goodness, the emergency might sweep us all away. By hypothesis, the emergency is happening right now. Do we have time to have a lengthy judicial process? And that's the way they that's the way they operate. And in fact, they get away with it because the judicial process does not work that quickly.
Especially when there's intentional obfuscation, concealing of the facts, twisting of wording, misrepresentation of things, silencing and censoring and discrediting and even stripping of licensure or titles or stuff from those who are bringing opposing arguments.
Well, who might? Because you think of the people who might do it, and the stripping of the licensure might be a physician. My physician says, I want to treat my patient. I know I can have success with my patients with this protocol. I don't want to send them to the hospital where they'll be put on a ventilator, because I'm very leery of that. People who put on ventilators generally die, very high percentage. Or people who have given remdesivir often die, very high percentage. I don't want that to happen to my patients, but I'm told by the public health office that if I continue to prescribe to my patients this, that, or the other protocol, someone is going to, the officials or someone in that group is going to challenge me on my licensure, and the next thing I know, I'm going to be removed from practice. So although I may have the money, although I may have the evidence, although I may have a lawyer that I can trust, I may very well want to back away from this because of my understanding that the courts don't always give us the right answers, and these medical boards don't always give the right answer, especially in this case where they're probably prejudiced against me. So the most likely individuals who would be in, you would think, the forefront of judicial challenges would have all sorts of personal reasons to back off from that. And the ones who might want to do it because Uncle Fred was killed in the nursing home wouldn't have the money to hire the lawyer. Or when they're confronted with a settlement offer, they'd accept it. And so the case goes away. And all of those people who took vaccinations and then suffered some kind of harm, well, the same situation there. Who has the lawyer? Who has the money? You have to have expert witnesses. And early on in this situation, of course, it was debatable whether you could tie certain injuries to taking the vaccine. Maybe not now, but certainly then. And that's when it was important potentially to stop the program or to limit it in some way. And so here we are now. They just come out with this new vaccine for anyone 6 months of age or older. They run no tests at all. They admit it. I saw it the other day. No tests at all. I guess it's all anecdotal, to quote Dr. Fauci. Well, that was his theory, right? If there weren't tests, according to some scientific protocol that he accepted, then it was anecdotal, and we couldn't accept it, right?
In the face of all of this, given our human susceptibility to fear as a response to a perceived threat to our well-being, and that's universal, that we all have that, and the vulnerability that places societies under if there are those who would exploit that to gain illegitimate authority, what are the inherent time delay mismatch between the ability of those in the executive role to take blitzkrieg action to strip people of freedoms versus the lengthy process it takes to try in the court whether that was legitimate or not, that we've already lost it by the time we get a determination saying that it shouldn't have happened. Where do you see a light at the end of the tunnel here? Where can people look to try to improve our odds against being victimized in this way going forward as individuals or as a society?
Well, it's supposedly the check and balance system. And the courts do provide a check and balance. The difficulty is that they're glacial in their movements. So probably you need some kind of legislation to move that process ahead faster in certain types of cases. And I can imagine how that would be done. I mean, it wouldn't be that hard to draft it, but it would have to be done. Move cases ahead on the docket. What shall I say? Limit the time that can be used between various motions and so forth. Getting a case to trial. Always the difficulty. See, the courts have the same difficulty as anybody else. Someone comes in and says, "Well, this vaccination program is using an untested vaccine, and therefore there isn't informed consent, and it has the potential of all sorts of dangers because the ferrets all died." And the court there is looking at that and says, "Well, wait a minute, I don't know that what you're telling me is true. I want something more than a bunch of allegations, because the alternative is some people who this vaccine might be working and some people who don't get it will become sick or die. So there's some kind of a balance of equities here on each side. What am I going to do?" And I suppose that's something you're never going to get around. So what do? Well, you impose draconian penalties on anyone in the public health field who gives us this kind of BS. All right? He goes to jail for 100 years or whatever it would be, that no one could face this if he makes that kind of a mistake. It's the man with the tiger in the cage, right? And so, okay, you're in the position of someone like Dr. Fauci, and you do this, that, and the other thing, and it's proved to be wrong later on because of the necessary slow working of the judicial system. But we prove this, then here's what happens to you. You're stripped of all of your property. Everything you have, you lose, and you go to prison for life. That's it. So you have to be thinking about this. You have to be thinking, yes, 6 months, 8 months down the line, this may be proven against me, and the next thing I know, I'm gone. The penalties have to be absolutely draconian. Now, we don't have that. And obviously Congress is not amenable to putting those in. Nobody's proposing that. But I don't think there's any other solution. You put those people into these positions where you get into the problems of emergencies, public health, these areas that have, they're sort of amoeba-like, and they can change their shape depending on what verbiage you use. And people can be very seriously harmed, and by the time the judicial system actually determines what the facts are, we've gone beyond the point. You make those decisions in those positions, and 6 months, a year later, we're not going to have any statute of limitations, by the way, on you. We remove all statute of limitations. You make those decisions, and it's proven later on, whatever it is, 5 years later, 7 years later, that you were sufficiently wrong. This is what happens to you. You're stripped of all property, and you go to jail for the rest of your life. So that, I think, would tend to, dampen the ardor of people who want to exercise or feel that they're entitled by some, personal superiority, to exercise abusive powers. But you look at the governor here that we were talking about. She comes up with this ukase, clearly unconstitutional. It's also a criminal act. Right? She's depriving people of a constitutional right under color of law with clearly no authority whatsoever. The governor does not have the authority to suspend the Second Amendment. Nobody can debate that. So somebody simply has to come along, and I don't know, you'd have to have a case in which the person carrying the gun was actually arrested, I think. Right? Because what's happening now is there's no action at all. Somebody could file an injunction against her to prevent future action, but let's assume we actually have somebody who was arrested by a sheriff. Then what would the federal government do? Well, federal prosecutor prosecute the governor immediately. And that's what we don't see. We don't see the federal official, the check and balance at that level. 18 U.S.C. Title 18 United States Code Section 242, which is designed, it was written for that purpose. It was written for the United States government to be able to come in and into the states and prosecute state, county, local officials who were violating individual civil rights. Looking to people like the Ku Klux Klan, all right, at the time, that was the operative organization, and you'd find the local sheriff or the local judge or whatever. He was performing his function during the day, and at night he was, riding with the Klan. In any event, it's a very old statute, but there it is. And one would think, well, that's one of the checks and balances here. When you have these runaway public officials at the state level, then the federal prosecutors have to come in and prosecute them criminally. See, these people can go after these people, the people who are harmed, can go after these people at the state level civilly. Title 42 of the United States Code, Section 1983. Anyone under color of state law who violates someone's constitutional rights can be sued civilly. And you can get an injunction, you can get damages, you can get attorney's fees. But that's a civil case. And under the civil case, these public officials have qualified immunity. Now, in the case of this governor with the emergency gun limitation, I don't think she has qualified immunity because it's an established fact that a governor cannot override federal constitutional right. But in the general case, they raise qualified immunity. They say, well, it isn't clearly established that I can't do this, and therefore I should not be held liable at this point. If I do it again, yeah, well, then maybe you can hold me liable the second time, but the first time you can't, okay? Well, this one is obviously not the case. But the problem is it's a civil lawsuit, and she would be sued for monetary damages, and I don't know what those would be. Deprivation of any constitutional right is damage, but if you haven't been personally harmed, well, it's like $1 in damage. They often give those in First Amendment cases where you can't show that any loss of something. So they give $1 in damages, and then they give an injunction telling the public official, well, don't do this again. And then they might give attorney's fees, so they could be harmed by the attorney's fees. But that's just money, right? Whereas in the criminal case, there is no qualified immunity defense. None. If you're found guilty, you suffer the criminal penalty, right? So if there were a check and balance here, I would say, oh, okay, only those people who were demented public officials at the at the state level would be doing some of these things, because they'd all realize that 2 days or 3 days after they announced this kind of a ban, they'd find themselves subject to a federal grand jury working on an indictment against them. But we don't have that. And the civil rights cases, of course, they take a long time. And I can't believe it, there's a qualified immunity defense here to just banning, outlawing action under the Second Amendment, given what the Supreme Court has recently ruled. But once again, what's the penalty? $1 worth of damages because you can't prove any other monetary loss. An injunction telling the governor, don't do this anymore. Well, okay, she won't do it anymore. And then maybe the attorney's fees that she might have to pay personally, unless she had some insurance policy or whatever, some way that the state would end up paying for her actions. And then she wouldn't have any consequence other than getting bad press, I guess. Having to show up in court for a couple of hearings. That would be it. So there's the problem. I don't see how you get around the certain amount of delay in any judicial process, or for that matter, executive process. I can imagine a situation where, with the Cuomo case, that Trump could have come out as soon as they found out that people were going to the nursing homes and putting these COVID cases. And Trump could have told Cuomo, if this continues, I am going to take every action I can under my constitutional authority to take care of the law, to execute, to see you criminally prosecuted. And I think it would have stopped right away. I can't imagine, and I'm singling out Cuomo, but I can't imagine anyone in the governor's position with that situation going on would not realize that maybe he did have some liability. And here's the president telling him, but it didn't happen. So you could have I can imagine situations that could happen very, very quickly with the president or a federal prosecutor, but these other ones that would require some kind of evaluation of the facts, you're never going to get around a certain amount of delay. And therefore, you have to have the recognition that once that process has gone to completion and it's been proven that the public official violated whatever, took this action without authority or took an action for which he had authority but the facts didn't fit, whatever it was, then comes into play immediately the penalty. So that anyone who's keeping that tiger in the cage has got to recognize that if that tiger gets loose somewhere down the line, he's going to be held personally liable, and seriously personally liable. And I don't think there's any other way around it. And obviously the public officials don't want that to happen. They don't want statutes like that.
Yeah, right. And there we haven't in this conversation, other than alluding to some of these bad actors in positions of authority, acting like two-bit princes or princesses or dictators, may not be acting on their own behalf. They may be placeholders under the color of law, being given directions by actors we don't know. And that makes it even more difficult to think, well, gee, why aren't there virtuous people rising up in government to say, let's put together this pieces of legislation to make sure that there's swift and punitive action that happens if people overstep their authority and knowingly, and then there may be very strong deep state vested interests or globalist interests or whatever that are preventing that last thing from happening. So
yeah, that's the interesting theory of public choice, which was invented many years ago by economist by the name of James Buchanan. Again, he eventually got the Nobel Prize for it. And the theory was that public officials don't always act in terms of, or for the reason, they don't always act by considerations of the public interest alone. They often act when considering their own private interests or the private interests of people who may be connected to them, such as lobbyists or people who might give them a very lucrative position once they come out of public office, right? So they're doing, and the agency's a classic for this, agency capture, they call it, where the agency bureaucrats act in favor of the entities they're supposedly regulating because they expect some kind of personal benefit from that, all right? Yeah, and that's the way it runs. And in many instances, you don't know what that is until that person is prosecuted. And then he starts singing, of course. I mean, that's another question. But you don't know why. You get these strange decisions coming out. Well, the decisions with the vaccines, right? Have they actually tested these sufficiently well? No, not really. Double talk back and forth. But we're going to use them anyway. Well, how much was that the product of influence being brought by pharmaceutical companies? Just call it that. And we know that for a very long time, people have said that the public health agencies tend to act in favor of the pharmaceutical companies. That's kind of an accepted proposition. Okay, well, that's fine if they're acting in favor of the public interest at the same time, maybe so. But what if they're not? And there's the difficulty. It's the hidden hand, potentially.
Yeah, and that's what I guess Dwight D. Eisenhower in his farewell address saying, "Beware the entanglements of the military-industrial complex," and now we have the medical-industrial complex, we have the agri-industrial complex, we've got lots of them, and we don't know on whose behalf they're acting, but it seems to be coming clearer to most people who are paying attention that it's not uniformly on the good of the ordinary people. Dr. Vieira, we are going to have to pick this up at another time, and grateful for your presence here with us always. If there's any nugget of takeaway that you'd like people to remember from this conversation, this would be a wonderful time to give a last thought to our viewers before we let you go.
Well, the nugget is there are no emergency powers per se, and anyone who claims an emergency power under some statute or constitutional provision has to be required to show that the facts of the situation meet the definition of the power.
Excellent. And any person in authority claiming emergency power should immediately raise a higher level of diligence on the part of the ordinary person. Whether there's the old saying, "Speak truth to power." Another one saying, "Question authority." That might be a special time to especially question authority, and it's difficult to do when that claim of authority comes with the warning of imminent danger to the individual. It tends to switch us into reptilian fear mode. Well, Dr. Vieira, it's always a treasure to be with you, spend time with you. On behalf of all of our listeners, thank you so much for joining us again on Liberty and Finance.
Well, thank you for the opportunity.
Miles Franklin Precious Metals is one of America's oldest and most trusted bullion dealers. Miles Franklin is A+ rated and accredited by the Better Business Bureau, licensed and bonded, and has 0 complaints ever registered. Here at Liberty and Finance, we are licensed brokers with Miles Franklin. To order, simply call us, discuss your needs, and we can let you know our live inventory, prices, and availability, and lock in your order over the phone. Once your order is locked, the price is held for you regardless of market fluctuations, and the metals are reserved for you awaiting your settled payment. Within 1 business day of ordering, you will receive an email invoice detailing the order and payment instructions. Miles Franklin accepts payments by bank wire, ACH or electronic check, money order, check mailed priority mail, and cryptocurrency. The fastest forms of payment are bank wire and cryptocurrency. Upon settled payment, metals will ship out within 3 to 5 business days. You will receive tracking information via email. Domestic shipping charges are $15 for any order under 500 ounces of silver or 10 ounces of gold. For orders larger than that, domestic shipping is free. The package will be boxed, fully insured, and labeled discreetly, with no indication of the contents inside. For your privacy, the name Miles Franklin will not even be on the package. To talk to myself, Kaiser, my brother Elijah, or my father Dunnigan, call 1-888-81-LIBERTY. That's 1-888-815-4237.